time, because there'll be still
some sort of a balance between.
yeah, but increasingly digital. Yeah, people go for that. That'll happen. And if you don't resolve this question of bridging this gap,
Right.
then I think it's in danger.
One question I had was, and I don't know again, like Ram, whether I'm romanticizing this, is the era of the great correspondent over? What I mean when I say that is when I think about the Hindu, I think about Mr. Rajan Bala, because I grew up reading his articles. I think about Subudu's reviews for the music season, Mr. Prabhu, etc., etc. When one talks about the New York Times, one thinks of Williams Affair or one of the English papers, Swanton, or so on and so forth. So when I think about a paper, some name occurs. And the reason why I ask you this is connected to what your ex-colleague, Mr. Paneerselvam, said when he was here. He said something which struck a chord with the people who are listening. He said quality journalism costs money. Today, if you had to send somebody to the Ukraine, if you had to send somebody to find out what happened in Pulwama, that costs money. You need to put him on a flight. You need to book him in a good hotel, give him 3 square meters a day. He needs time to pass through a complex situation. And because of the bottom line for a lot of papers being what it is, there is not much scope for nuance, which is why you end up watching TV channels where one Indian general abuses another general and a Pakistani general abuses another. There's a slanging match, and there's no lot of heat, but there's no light. So in that sense, given costs, is that era over of, I mean, no disrespect meant to a lot of good journalists who are there, but I don't know if we are going to associate newspapers in future with a particular columnist or a correspondent.
I think that's true. There's a certain flattening. We had, I remember many, to add to your list, Jack Fingleton.
Jack Fingleton, yes.
Who, who played in the Bodyline series, and you know that. He, or in the Hindu's case, G.K. Reddy. Sometimes
yes,
he was criticized for overwriting, but
yes.
the other day somebody in the New York Times wanted to look at a subject, and I had sent him PDFs from our archives, and he was astonished to find, who's this man? I'd love to meet him. He loved it because he was so dominant
right.
on this subject. And there are others from other newspapers, Girilal Jain,
yes,
Frank Moraes,
yes, yes.
People like that, and many others. I think, and then for foreign correspondents, I think a very famous one in India was James Cameron.
Yes.
From the time of Nehru. He's written beautifully about it, how he was allowed to go anywhere, but just accommodated. He just to say it, he had entertainment allowances. He stayed for weeks and months in other countries on visits. So
today's
now
bottom
they're
line,
tight-fisted. You got to prove that it's worth it.
right.
And give them assurances in advance. There are some exceptions like the New York Times,
Yes.
which I think because of the growth in digital revenues, it has
Yes.
actually hired more journalists
Yes.
after suffering many losses earlier before it got onto this track. So, but I think it is true. You won't find the kind of dominant journalistic figures, whether you fully agreed with them or not. Karanjia, Blitz,
Yes. Yes.
and so on. The newspaper publication was known by the names of these people.
By the names.
Yeah, so I think that era is gone, and it is inevitable.
So just taking a cue from what you said just now, is the paywall the way forward for all papers? I was reading somewhere that due to the pandemic, the Hindu's digital subscription has increased. So is that the future?
Yes, but from a very low base. And it's still print that pays the bills.
I see.
So the strategy in India would be first, I think, that print would meet the costs of production, and digital is your margin.
Right.
That's the approach. But digital, I would say, is still single digits, share of revenues.
I see. A long way to go.
Virtually every newspaper. No newspaper, I think, can claim more than that, unless you're talking about very small niche publications,
yes.
like the Ken.
Yes. Those are all paid articles.
Yeah. So, but on paywalls, yes, I think you have to go beyond paywalls. The only exception I see is the Guardian, where they've done,
Which
first
requests you to pay, if possible.
Yes, they became a global newspaper first, established their presence, and in fact, in some years was even ahead of the New York Times. Before that, Guardian had 250,000
Yes.
subscribers in print. But now it runs into millions, but it's open, free, free content, free to air, so to speak. But as you just mentioned, they say good journalism needs money. You need to pay for it. So please contribute. And that, I think, has provided a
And that's been successful
inspiring
too for the Guardian.
Yeah,
A lot of
so-
people are willing to pay for quality.
Apart from
journalism.
advertising, digital, they get that. So I think it was in trouble, it's come out of that, and now I think it's a good time for it.
I'll take one final question from RBK and then we'll go to the audience. Just give me one final question from here. One question from RBK is, has journalism become more personality based than issue based?
That's, I think, true about television to some extent. But for example, even Pranoy Roy, I think Pranoy Roy's budgets, he was quite iconic.
Yes.
But he has pulled back a little and allowed others to do it. But there are channels where, Rajdeep Sardesai,
Right.
Karan Thapar earlier, and Arnab, of course, for the right. And I think in Tamil channels which I watch, there's some very fine journalists who, the brand, I think, has been enhanced by these people. Kartikai Chelvan and then of Pudhiya Thalaimurai and Guna, Sun News. Although it's owned by a family connected with politics, he's a thorough professional. And I think the channel's quality is defined by these leaders. But not in the old way, where I think some of them hogged space. They wouldn't let others enter their turf. They're very fierce. They're very fierce in that respect. But today, I think it's more collegial.
We have a question from the audience.
So good evening, Mr. Ram. That's me, Suresh. So I have a question. So we were talking about the Nextgen, and one of the things that I have observed is that the Nextgen typically tends to be very passionate about some things. Like you talk about climate change, you talk about issues that they are really concerned with, LGBTQ rights. At the institute that I run, I had 400 students show up for, a rainbow parade, in Chennai. And, so the thing that I'm kind of particularly interested in is, are the news media doing enough justice to questions that matter to this generation? Or are we just simply trying to, you talked about the theory of the interlocking public. Are we just basically diluting our focus by trying to cater to multiple audiences rather than trying to, genuinely bridge the gap and try to address the questions that are of relevance to this generation?
I think that's a very good point, and from your own experience, I think that's one of the things the research found, that they can be passionate. It's not that they are apolitical. They connect strongly to issues. And to be fair, the media, the newspapers I read, or some of the television programs I watch do considerable justice to these issues. We take NDTV, for example, on conservation or child rights, sexual exploitation of children and so on. I think they've done a good job. So there's some gap there, that the content is available, but you're not able to connect in a satisfactory way with that. So it's not easy to answer that why, but I think it's true that they are passionate, and the format must be something. But if they don't come to your newspaper at all or watch television, and there is evidence that TV watching among the young is going down, they go to the internet, and even there I think there are some people who leave it. They want quick things. So I think it's also for them to figure out. They have to be educated also in their classrooms, or at least discussion should take place on how on earth are you going to learn about this question about which you are so passionate. If you are so fleet-footed, switch from one to the other, why don't you focus on it? Of course, there is literature they can look at. There's academic and scholarly and scientific literature they can look at. But in terms of news about wider happenings, how on earth are you going to equip yourself to learn and think for yourself on these issues if you don't have adequate information, for which you need to go to these places? That's from the other end. But for the news media, I think you have, some very good articles. Take NEET, for example, on which there is a lot of, the different kinds of views, even in Tamil Nadu, although the mass of people see it's a very, they feel very strongly against this, that it's inequitable, it goes against social justice, it goes against state rights, it goes against what the state wants. Today, the Hindu has an article based on Chief Minister Stalin's speech, where it's a very reasoned speech. Now, unless you read these things and read also the opposite side, why NEET was put in place, why the Supreme Court first ruled it unconstitutional and later on recalled its judgment, why the central government, this BJP government, is pushing it in a way that makes it, goes against its own interests in Tamil Nadu. Unless you get this kind of information, how will you make up your mind, those interested in this subject, on an issue like that? So I think you need news for that. You need news consumption or engagement with news for this kind of information, which is not easily available anywhere else. This is the easiest way to get to it. You are able to read, you are educated, and the material is available. You can look at different points of view. But why do you keep away? So it's also their responsibility. The burden is also on them. And that can come from the classroom, from good teachers, from those who not just lecture, but engage with them on this and try to persuade them. And you're always going to have a certain proportion which will refuse to engage with news among particularly young people, but also among older people sometimes, middle-aged and so on. But so I think the effort has to come from both sides. But the short answer to your question is I think the material, the news, the content is available to a